the spring of 1834, somewhere in the rolling hills of central Virginia, a discovery was made that would forever change how we understand the depths of human evil. 47 children, ages ranging from 6 to 16, were found chained in a basement beneath what appeared to be an ordinary farmhouse. The children bore no resemblance to each other, spoke different languages, and when questioned, could only whisper one name through their tears: Mother Sullivan. The local sheriff's report, buried for over a century in the Henrico County archives, describes scenes so disturbing that 3 of the investigating officers resigned from duty within a week. What makes this case truly haunting isn't just the horror of what was found, but the chilling realization that Constance Sullivan had been operating her twisted enterprise for over 2 decades without detection. The children called her Mother, but the truth behind that title would prove far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue with the story of the Sullivan family and their unspeakable secrets, I want to ask you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You understand that some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear stories like this from your own backyard? The question that haunted investigators then, and continues to perplex historians today, is how such a massive operation could have gone undetected for so long in a close-knit rural community. The Virginia of 1834 was a land caught between 2 worlds. The old plantation system still dominated the social landscape, while whispers of industrial change drifted down from the north. In this environment, the small farming community of Millbrook, a collection of perhaps 50 families spread across the gentle slopes of Henrico County, represented the typical American rural settlement of the era. Most residents farmed tobacco or corn, traded at Henderson's general store, and gathered for social events at the one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a community meeting hall. The Sullivan property sat on the outskirts of this community, a modest 2-story wooden farmhouse surrounded by nearly 200 acres of prime agricultural land. To any traveler passing along the dusty road that connected Millbrook to Richmond, the Sullivan farm appeared utterly unremarkable. The house itself, built in the Federal style popular during the 1810s, featured white-painted clapboard siding and a wraparound porch typical of Virginia architecture. A red barn stood 60 yards behind the house, with a chicken coop and smokehouse completing the typical farmstead layout. What made the Sullivan property unique wasn't visible from the road. Ezra Sullivan, who had purchased the land in 1809 with money inherited from his father's tobacco fortune, had spent considerable effort expanding the house's basement. While most Virginia homes of the period featured simple root cellars, the Sullivan basement extended far beyond the footprint of the house above. Local craftsmen remembered being hired for various excavation projects throughout the 1810s and 1820s, though none had seen the completed work. Ezra paid well and in cash, asking only that the workers focus on their assigned sections rather than the overall project. Constance Sullivan, Ezra's wife, had arrived in Millbrook in 1811 as a bride of 22. Neighbors remembered her as a handsome woman with dark hair and an unusually soft voice. She dressed simply but neatly, attended the Methodist church services when health permitted, and maintained a reputation for charitable works. When approached about contributing to community causes, Constance would inevitably explain that she and Ezra were already caring for several orphaned children from her family back in Pennsylvania. The arrangement, she explained, was temporary, just until suitable permanent homes could be found. This explanation satisfied the community's curiosity about the occasional glimpses of children around the Sullivan property. Mrs. Henderson at the general store would sometimes see a young face peering from the Sullivan wagon when Constance came to town for supplies. The children never spoke, but Constance would explain that they were shy, traumatized by the loss of their parents, and needed time to adjust to their new circumstances. The community, familiar with the tragedy of orphaned children in an era of high mortality rates, accepted these explanations without question. Thomas Henderson, who ran the general store, later recalled that Constance Sullivan was one of his most reliable customers. Every 2 weeks, She would arrive with a detailed list and enough cash to purchase substantial quantities of basic foodstuffs: flour, cornmeal, salt pork, molasses, and other staples. The quantities seemed large for a childless couple, but when Thomas mentioned this, Constance would remind him about the orphaned children. She also purchased unusual amounts of basic medicines, explaining that children from poor circumstances often arrived with various ailments that required treatment. The Sullivan farm operated on a schedule that puzzled some neighbors. While most farming families rose with the sun and worked until dusk, activity at the Sullivan property often continued well into the evening. Lights could be seen in the farmhouse windows at unusual hours, and the sound of hammering or construction work sometimes echoed across the fields during the night. When asked about these activities, Ezra would explain that he was making improvements to accommodate the growing number of children in their care. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who served the Millbrook area, remembered being called to the Sullivan farm on several occasions during the 1820s and early 1830s. Each time he was told that one of the orphaned children had fallen ill and needed medical attention. However, Dr. Whitfield was never permitted to examine the children directly. Instead, Constance would describe the symptoms and request specific medications. When the doctor insisted on seeing his patients, Constance would explain that the children were too frightened of strangers, too traumatized by their experiences to allow examination by unfamiliar men. The deception was so complete that even the local pastor, Reverend Samuel Matthews, believed in the Sullivan family's charitable work. During his occasional visits to the farm, Reverend Matthews would praise Constance and Ezra for their Christian compassion in caring for so many unfortunate children. He offered to help find permanent homes for the orphans, but Constance would always explain that she was already in correspondence with relatives in Pennsylvania who would eventually take the children. The process, she assured him, simply required patience and careful arrangement. What none of the community members realized was that Constance Sullivan had been perfecting her deception for over 2 decades. The orphaned children were not temporary residents awaiting placement with loving families. They were prisoners, purchased, kidnapped, or lured from their families across multiple states, held in conditions that would make hardened criminals weep with horror. The discovery that would expose the Sullivan family's horrific secrets began with a series of seemingly unrelated incidents in the early months of 1834. February had been unusually harsh, with temperatures dropping well below freezing for weeks at a time. The bitter cold that gripped Virginia that winter would prove to be both a blessing and a curse for the 47 children trapped beneath the Sullivan farmhouse. On February 23, 1834, a traveling merchant named Jacob Stern was making his way from Richmond to Charlottesville when a violent snowstorm forced him to seek shelter. The Sullivan farm, being the closest building visible from the road, seemed like a natural choice for emergency accommodation. Ezra Sullivan, despite his obvious reluctance, could hardly refuse hospitality to a stranded traveler during such dangerous weather. Stern later described the evening as uncomfortably tense. Constance Sullivan served a simple meal of cornbread and salt pork, but conversation was stilted and awkward. The Sullivans seemed nervous, constantly exchanging glances and starting at every sound. When Stern asked about the children he had been told lived on the farm, Constance explained that they were all sleeping and mustn't be disturbed. The children, she said, had been ill with fever and needed their rest. What disturbed Stern most was the sound. Throughout the night, as he lay on a makeshift bed in the Sullivan parlor, he could hear what sounded like muffled crying coming from beneath the floor. When he mentioned this to Ezra the next morning, Sullivan claimed it was probably just wind whistling through gaps in the foundation. The sound was common in old houses, especially during cold weather. Stern accepted this explanation, but something about the Sullivans' manner continued to trouble him. The second incident occurred 3 weeks later on March 15th. Mary Catherine Flynn, a young Irish immigrant traveling with her family to seek work in the tobacco fields around Richmond, became separated from their group during a river crossing. Exhausted and frightened, she made her way to the Sullivan farm as darkness fell. Constance Sullivan took her in, offering food and shelter for the night. Mary Catherine was never seen alive again. When her family reported her missing to the sheriff in Richmond, they described their last known location and the direction Mary Catherine had been heading. A search party was organized, but the vast expanses of Virginia wilderness made finding a single missing person nearly impossible. The search was called off after a week, and Mary Catherine Flynn was presumed to have died of exposure or been killed by wild animals. The final incident that would lead to the discovery occurred on April 2nd, 1834. A local farmer named William Hutchinson was hunting rabbits in the woods that bordered the Sullivan property when he heard something that stopped him cold. From somewhere near the Sullivan farmhouse came the sound of children screaming. Not the ordinary cries of youngsters at play, but raw, desperate shrieks of pure terror. Hutchinson crept closer to investigate, hiding behind a stand of oak trees about 50 yards from the Sullivan house. For nearly an hour, he watched and listened. The screaming continued intermittently, always seeming to come from beneath the house rather than from inside it. At one point, he saw Ezra Sullivan emerge from what appeared to be a cellar door on the side of the house. Sullivan looked around nervously, then disappeared back underground. When Hutchinson reported what he had witnessed to his neighbors, opinions were divided. Some suggested that the orphaned children might be more troubled than the Sullivans had indicated, perhaps requiring discipline or medical treatment that could be distressing. Others, however, began to remember odd details that hadn't seemed important before. The unusual amounts of food Constance Sullivan purchased, the strange sounds neighbors occasionally heard at night, the fact that none of the supposed orphans had ever been seen in town or at community gatherings. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, a veteran lawman who had served Henrico County for over 15 years, initially dismissed the concerns as neighborhood gossip. However, when William Hutchinson approached him directly and insisted on filing a formal complaint, Crawford agreed to investigate. The law required him to follow up on reports of potential child abuse, regardless of his personal opinion of the accusers. On the morning of April 8, 1834, Sheriff Crawford rode out to the Sullivan farm, accompanied by his deputy, Marcus Webb. They arrived just after sunrise, expecting to conduct a routine inspection that would put the community rumors to rest. Constance Sullivan met them at the door, her manner calm and welcoming. She invited the officers inside for coffee and expressed concern about the gossip circulating in the community. The conversation began normally enough. Constance explained again about the orphaned children, showed the officers letters she claimed to have received from relatives in Pennsylvania, and offered to arrange for the children to meet with Sheriff Crawford once they recovered from their recent illness. Everything seemed perfectly reasonable until Deputy Webb asked to use the privy. As Webb walked around the side of the house, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The cellar door that William Hutchinson had seen Ezra Sullivan using was secured with 3 separate padlocks. Heavy chains wrapped around the door handles, and the wood around the locks showed signs of desperate clawing, as if someone had tried to scratch their way out from the inside. When Webb returned to the house and quietly informed Sheriff Crawford about what he had observed, both men knew they were dealing with something far more serious than community gossip. Crawford politely asked Constance to show them the cellar, explaining that a thorough inspection would help put the rumors to rest. The change in Constance Sullivan's demeanor was immediate and chilling. Her face went pale, her hands began to tremble, and she began stammering about how the cellar was dangerous, how the children weren't allowed down there, how there was nothing to see but old farm equipment and storage. That was when they heard it. From somewhere beneath their feet came the sound of children crying, followed by a weak voice calling for help. The sound was muffled but unmistakable, and it was coming from directly below the kitchen where they stood. The immediate aftermath of that first discovery would haunt Sheriff Crawford for the rest of his life. When he and Deputy Webb forced open the cellar door, the stench that rose from the darkness below was overwhelming. A mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else that Crawford later described as the smell of despair itself. The basement that Ezra Sullivan had spent over 2 decades constructing was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. The main chamber stretched far beyond the footprint of the house above, extending into the earth like an underground warren. Stone walls, carefully mortared and designed to muffle sound, created a series of interconnected rooms. The largest chamber, directly beneath the kitchen, housed most of the children. They were chained to iron rings embedded in the stone walls, each child secured by shackles around their ankles. The chains were long enough to allow movement within a small area, but prevented any possibility of escape. The children ranged in age from approximately 6 to 16 years old. They were emaciated, their clothes reduced to rags, their bodies bearing the marks of prolonged neglect and abuse. Many showed signs of illness, fever, respiratory problems, and skin conditions that came from living in the damp, unventilated underground space. What struck both officers most forcefully was the silence. After the initial cries for help, the children said nothing. They simply stared at the newcomers with eyes that held no hope, no expectation of rescue. Deputy Webb, a father of 4, had to leave the basement twice to vomit. Sheriff Crawford, despite his years of law enforcement experience, found himself unable to process the full scope of what he was seeing. The methodical nature of the imprisonment, the evidence of long-term planning, the sheer number of victims. It was beyond anything in his experience or imagination. In the smaller chambers, Crawford and Webb found evidence of the Sullivan system of control. One room contained stocks and restraining devices for punishment. Another held what appeared to be a primitive medical area where the children were treated for injuries and illnesses, not out of compassion, but to keep them alive and functional. A third room contained detailed records that would prove crucial to the investigation. Names, ages, dates of arrival, and notes about each child's condition and behavior. The records revealed the scope of the Sullivan operation. Children had been arriving at the farm regularly since 1812, shortly after Constance Sullivan came to Millbrook. The sources varied. Some were orphans purchased from overwhelmed poorhouses. Others were runaways lured by promises of food and shelter, and still others appeared to have been simply kidnapped from their families. The record showed that over the years, more than 90 children had passed through the Sullivan basement. The obvious question, what had happened to the others, was answered in the most horrifying way possible. In a separate chamber, reached through a narrow passage that required crawling. Crawford and Webb found the remains of at least 36 children. Some appeared to have died from illness or malnutrition. Others showed signs of violence. All had been buried in shallow graves beneath the basement floor, their bodies covered with lime to control odor and decay. The investigation that followed the initial discovery would continue for months, as authorities struggled to understand how such a massive criminal enterprise had operated undetected for over 2 decades. The answer lay in Constance Sullivan's genius for deception and her understanding of human psychology. She had created a persona that was almost perfectly designed to avoid suspicion in a rural 1830s community. The character of the charitable woman caring for orphaned children appealed to the community's Christian values while explaining away any unusual aspects of the Sullivan household. The story of traumatized children who were too frightened to interact with strangers provided a ready excuse for why the supposed orphans were never seen in public. The claim that permanent homes were being arranged with distant relatives explained why the children never seemed to leave the farm. Even more cleverly, Constance had created multiple layers of protection for her operation. The children were taught to call her mother, ensuring that if anyone ever overheard them, it would seem like a natural family relationship. The few times children had been glimpsed by outsiders, they had been carefully coached to remain silent and appear shy rather than terrified. The substantial food purchases were explained by the presence of multiple children, while the medical supplies were justified by the supposed poor health of orphaned youngsters. The physical setup of the operation was equally well planned. The basement construction had been spread over many years, with different workers handling different aspects of the project. No single craftsman had seen the complete layout or understood the true purpose of the modifications. The soundproofing was effective enough that even close neighbors rarely heard anything suspicious, and when they did, the sounds could be explained as ordinary farm activities or the normal noise of children playing. Perhaps most disturbing was the psychological control system that Constance had developed. The children were told that they had been abandoned by their families, that no one was looking for them, and that the outside world was dangerous and hostile. Those who behaved properly were given slightly better food and living conditions. Those who caused trouble were subjected to punishments that served as examples to the others. Over time, most of the children accepted their captivity as simply the way their lives were meant to be. The community's reaction to the discovery was one of complete shock and disbelief. Many residents initially refused to believe that Constance Sullivan, the quiet woman who had lived among them for over 20 years, could be capable of such monstrous acts. Some suggested that she must have been coerced by her husband, or that the whole situation was somehow a misunderstanding. These denials became impossible to maintain as more evidence emerged. The detailed records found in the basement included not just information about the children, but also correspondence with criminal contacts in other states. Constance Sullivan had been part of a network that trafficked in children, buying and selling young victims across state lines. The Sullivan farm was just one operation in a larger criminal enterprise that stretched from Pennsylvania to Georgia. As Sheriff Crawford delved deeper into the Sullivan case, disturbing patterns began to emerge that suggested the operation was far more sophisticated than initially believed. The correspondence found in the basement revealed that Constance Sullivan had been in regular contact with at least 12 other individuals across 5 states, all apparently involved in similar activities. The letters, written in a simple code that was eventually deciphered, discussed merchandise, deliveries, and quality control in language that clearly referred to human trafficking. One letter, dated just 3 months before the discovery, came from someone identified only as A. Morrison in Philadelphia. Morrison wrote that he had 6 new items of varying ages and conditions that would be suitable for your requirements. The letter included detailed descriptions of the children, their approximate ages, and their physical conditions. Most disturbingly, it included notes about their temperaments, which children were compliant, and which might require additional training. The financial records painted an even more horrifying picture. Constance Sullivan had been paying between $50 and $200 per child, depending on age and condition. She had also been receiving payments from other locations, suggesting that the Sullivan farm served as both a destination and a distribution point for trafficked children. The total amount of money involved was staggering for the time period. Over $8,000 in transactions over 2 decades, equivalent to several $100,000 in modern currency. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling physician who had been called to the Sullivan farm on several occasions, became a key witness as the investigation expanded. Under questioning, he revealed that Constance Sullivan had always been unusually specific about the medications she requested. She had detailed knowledge of treating malnutrition, respiratory infections, and other conditions common in severely neglected children. She had also asked for sedatives and other drugs that could be used to control difficult prisoners. The doctor's testimony led to another chilling realization. Constance Sullivan had been systematically studying how to keep large numbers of children alive under conditions of extreme deprivation. The medical supplies she purchased, the questions she asked, even the layout of the basement, everything was designed to maximize the survival rate of her prisoners while minimizing the resources required to maintain them. Local businessman Thomas Henderson provided additional pieces of the puzzle. A review of his sales record showed that Constance Sullivan had been purchasing increasing quantities of basic supplies over the years. What appeared to be the growing needs of a charitable household was actually evidence of an expanding criminal operation. Henderson also remembered specific requests for items that seemed unusual at the time: extra blankets, large quantities of children's clothing, and bulk purchases of simple medicines. The investigation also revealed the role of Ezra Sullivan in the operation. While Constance appeared to be the mastermind, Ezra was responsible for the physical maintenance of the prison and the handling of the children. Several of the surviving victims, when they were finally able to speak, described him as the enforcer who carried out punishments and maintained discipline. His construction work on the basement hadn't been just expansion. It had been constant refinement of a system designed to hold human beings in captivity. The most disturbing revelation came from analyzing the records of children who had disappeared from the Sullivan farm over the years. The ledgers showed that some children had been transferred to other locations, suggesting a network of buyers and sellers across multiple states. Others had been marked as unsuitable or problematic, entries that corresponded with the remains found in the basement burial chamber. The scope of the investigation expanded as authorities in other states began examining their own unsolved disappearances.